He was supposed to follow every voice, but on that cold morning, the white K9 refused every command except silence. The air over the rural search and rescue staging area in Northern Virginia carried a damp chill, the kind that clung to jackets and made every breath feel heavier than it should have been. Floodlights from temporary response vehicles cut through the fog in soft cones, revealing patches of muddy ground, scattered equipment cases, and the faint outlines of responders moving with careful urgency. At the center of it all stood a German shepherd unlike any other, his coat almost completely white with faint cream shadows along his shoulders, his frame lean, worn, and trembling not from fear but from something deeper, something unresolved. They called him Ghost, a name given not for mystery but for how he behaved, as if part of him still existed somewhere else entirely, unreachable no matter how close anyone got. He had been brought in after being found wandering near a closed training corridor, no collar, no identification, just eyes that tracked every movement but never settled on safety. Multiple handlers had tried to approach him that morning, speaking softly, extending hands, offering water, even kneeling to appear less threatening, but Ghost responded to none of it. He would step back each time, not aggressively, not with hostility, but with a quiet refusal that felt almost intentional, like he was waiting for something no one there understood. Around him, the rescue team exchanged glances, their radios hissing softly with updates that never seemed to matter to the dog standing in the center of their attention. Then, without announcement, a black military transport SUV rolled to a stop at the edge of the clearing, tires crunching into wet gravel. The door opened slowly, and a man stepped out, pausing for a moment as if he already knew what he was walking into. His name was Daniel Cooper, a former Marine whose posture still carried the discipline of service even in stillness, his uniform replaced now by a simple field jacket, his movements controlled, measured, and quiet. He did not speak at first. He simply looked toward the crowd, then toward the white K9 standing under the floodlights, and something in his expression shifted, subtle, almost imperceptible, like a memory pressing against the present. Ghost lifted his head. It was not immediate, not dramatic, just a small change in stillness, as if a distant sound only he could hear had passed through the fog. His ears angled forward slightly, his weight shifting from one paw to another, tension gathering in his body in a way no one else noticed at first. A handler nearby whispered that the dog had been unresponsive all morning, that nothing had broken through whatever wall he had built inside himself. But Daniel did not move closer yet. He stopped at a distance that felt almost deliberate, letting the space between them exist without pressure, without demand. The fog thickened again, drifting through the light beams, softening edges, muting sounds. For a moment, everything felt suspended in a quiet that was almost unnatural, as if the world itself had paused to observe what would happen next. Ghost took one step forward, then stopped. His eyes locked on Daniel, not in recognition yet, but in hesitation, like a question forming without words. Daniel lowered his gaze slightly, not breaking eye contact, not forcing it either. He exhaled slowly, as though steadying something inside himself rather than outside. And then he said it, just one name, barely louder than the wind moving through the trees. The sound did not carry far, but it did not need to. Ghost froze completely, every muscle in his body going still as if time had tightened around him. The handlers noticed the change immediately. The refusal, the resistance, the distance. All of it collapsed into a single point of stillness that no one dared interrupt. The white K9's breathing slowed, then deepened, uneven at first, then controlled, like something buried deep beneath memory had begun to surface. Daniel did not move closer. He simply waited, his eyes steady, his presence calm in a way that did not demand attention but held it anyway. Ghost's stance shifted again, this time not backward, but inward, as if the weight he had been carrying could no longer remain balanced. A soft sound escaped him, not a bark, not a whine, but something fractured and quiet, the kind of sound that did not belong to the present moment but to somewhere far behind it. And then his legs weakened slightly, not from injury, not from exhaustion, but from recognition arriving all at once, too heavy to stand against. The handlers moved instinctively, stepping forward, but Daniel raised a hand just slightly, not as a command, but as a broas, asking for stillness. Ghost's gaze never left him. The fog parted briefly as a faint breeze moved through the clearing, brushing against the white fur along the K9's face. In that moment, nothing else mattered. The vehicles, the voices, the floodlights, all of it faded into something distant and unimportant. There was only the space between a man and a dog who had once shared something neither of them had fully understood until now. And as Ghost finally lowered himself to the ground, not in surrender but in release, it was clear that whatever had brought them to this moment had never truly been lost, only waiting. The moment the white K9 lowered himself to the ground, the entire clearing seemed to change its temperature, not in a physical sense, but in the way every human present instinctively became quieter, more aware, as if they had stepped into something private and fragile that did not belong to them. Daniel Cooper remained still at the edge of the floodlight's reach, his hands relaxed at his sides, his breathing slow and deliberate, while Ghost stayed frozen in that lowered position, eyes locked on him with an intensity that no one in the rescue team could interpret. The handlers exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether to intervene or remain observers, because the animal that had refused every attempt at rescue was now doing something even more unusual. He was not resisting anymore, but remembering. A faint wind moved through the clearing, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine, and with it came a subtle shift in Ghost's posture. His ears tilted slightly, not toward sound, but toward recognition, as if something familiar had finally broken through a wall that had held for too long. Daniel took one slow step forward, careful, unhurried, as though any sudden movement might undo whatever fragile connection was forming in the space between them. The white K9 did not retreat. Instead, his chest rose and fell in uneven rhythm, his body tense but no longer defensive, like a memory struggling to surface beneath layers of silence. One of the younger handlers whispered that the dog had been found alone, that no one had been able to trace his origin, but the words felt distant now, irrelevant to what was unfolding. Daniel stopped again, closer this time, but still maintaining distance, and when he spoke, his voice was barely more than air moving through the cold. It was a name, simple and unadorned, spoken without force or expectation. Ghost reacted instantly, not with movement, but with stillness so complete it felt heavier than motion. His eyes widened slightly, not in fear, but in recognition that arrived like a wave rather than a thought. The floodlights hummed above them, and for a brief moment even that sound seemed distant, as if the world had narrowed to a single thread of connection between man and animal. Daniel's expression did not change outwardly, but something inside him softened in a way that could not be concealed, a quiet acknowledgement that what he was seeing was not confusion, but memory returning after being buried too long. Ghost slowly lifted his head higher, the first deliberate movement since he had lowered himself, and in that motion there was hesitation, uncertainty, and something deeper that resembled trust struggling to re-emerge. The handlers stepped back slightly without being told, sensing that any intrusion would fracture the moment. Daniel took another step, then stopped again, now only a few yards away. His gaze never left Ghost, and Ghost's gaze never left him, but the tension between them was no longer about distance or fear. It was about recognition trying to find its shape in the present. A faint sound came from Ghost then, low and fractured, not a bark and not a whine, but something in between, as though his voice itself was unsure how to return after so long in silence. Daniel's jaw tightened briefly, not in emotion outwardly expressed, but in restraint, as if he was holding back the weight of everything he had not allowed himself to feel. The fog drifted again through the clearing, thinner now, revealing sharper edges of light and shadow across the white coat of the K9. Ghost shifted forward slightly, one paw at a time, hesitant but no longer resisting, drawn by something deeper than command or training. Daniel did not move to meet him halfway. He simply waited, letting the distance close on its own terms, understanding that what was happening could not be rushed. And then, in a moment that felt smaller than everything leading up to it, yet heavier than all of it combined, Ghost finally moved forward without stopping, his steps unsteady at first, then more certain, until the remaining space between them disappeared entirely. He stopped just in front of Daniel, close enough that the air between them felt shared rather than separate. Daniel slowly lowered one hand, not reaching, not grabbing, just offering presence. Ghost hesitated for only a second before pressing forward, not with force, but with surrender that carried the weight of memory, recognition, and something long withheld finally returning home. The clearing remained silent except for the faint sound of wind through the trees, and in that silence, nothing needed to be said for the moment to be understood. The moment Ghost pressed forward into Daniel Cooper, the entire world seemed to contract into something smaller, quieter, and more fragile than anyone standing in that clearing had expected to witness. There was no sudden movement, no dramatic collapse, only the slow surrender of a living memory finally finding its anchor. Daniel did not reach out immediately. He held still, allowing the white K9 to decide the distance, the contact, the meaning of what was happening between them. Ghost's breathing was uneven at first, shallow and uncertain, as if his body had forgotten how to exist in a moment without tension. His head lowered slightly until it rested near Daniel's chest, not in submission, but in recognition that felt older than time. The floodlights above continued to hum softly, their artificial glow casting long, pale reflections across the damp ground, but even that sound felt distant now, as if the clearing had been sealed away from the rest of the world. Daniel finally lowered his hand, slow and deliberate, and placed it gently along Ghost's shoulder. The touch was not commanding, not corrective, but familiar in a way that carried weight beyond words. Ghost flinched only for a fraction of a second, then leaned in further, pressing closer as though confirming that what he was sensing was real and not a fragment of memory breaking apart inside him. Around them, the rescue team remained silent, no longer attempting to interpret or interfere, because what they were witnessing did not belong to procedure or protocol. It belonged to something far more personal, something that could not be measured in reports or explained through training logs. Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze lowering for a brief moment before returning to Ghost, and when he spoke again, it was not with command, but with a tone that carried exhaustion, relief, and recognition all at once. Ghost responded not with sound, but with presence, his body finally relaxing in a way that suggested he no longer needed to hold himself together. The white coat that had once refused every attempt at approach now stood completely still beside the man he had rejected all morning, as if the resistance that defined him had dissolved into understanding. A faint breeze moved through the clearing again, softer this time, lifting the edges of Ghost's fur and carrying away the last remnants of tension that had filled the air moments earlier. One of the handlers quietly lowered his radio, unsure of what to report, because nothing about this situation fit the language of standard recovery operations. Daniel shifted slightly, adjusting his stance to remain steady as Ghost leaned more fully into him, the contact now unmistakably mutual, grounded, and real. There was no urgency in the moment, only recognition unfolding at its own pace, like something returning after a long absence that neither of them had fully understood until now. Ghost's eyes, once locked in guarded silence, softened as he remained close, his body no longer rigid but anchored, as if the act of standing beside. Daniel had resolved something internal that had been unresolved for far too long. Daniel's hand remained on him, unmoving, steady, offering a kind of reassurance that required no explanation. The clearing itself seemed to settle, the fog thinning slightly as though even nature acknowledged the shift that had taken place. For the first time since the operation began, Ghost did not look away, did not retreat, did not hesitate. He simply stayed, as if the search he had been resisting had finally ended not in discovery, but in return. And in that quiet stillness, with nothing spoken and nothing demanded, the space between them became something neither of them needed to escape again. Daniel Cooper remained still as Ghost stayed pressed close to him, the white K9 no longer resisting the world around him, but instead anchoring himself to the only presence that felt real in a place filled with unfamiliar noise and light. The clearing had not changed physically, yet everything within it had shifted in a way that made time feel slower, almost suspended. The rescue team stood at a respectful distance, their earlier confusion replaced by a quiet awareness that whatever they were witnessing was not part of routine procedure, but something far more personal and deeply rooted in memory. Daniel's hand remained steady on Ghost's shoulder, not gripping, not guiding, only present, as if he understood that any force would break the fragile balance that had formed. Ghost finally exhaled in a long, uneven breath, his body easing further, his weight settling fully into the contact, as though he had been carrying something heavy for a long time without realizing it until now. Daniel's eyes lowered briefly, and when he spoke again, it was not to command or explain, but to acknowledge something unspoken between them, a connection that had survived distance, silence, and time. Ghost responded by shifting his head slightly, pressing closer, his eyes no longer scanning the environment, but remaining fixed on Daniel, as if afraid that looking away might undo the moment entirely. A faint sound of movement came from one of the handlers, but no one interrupted, because even they could sense that the situation had moved beyond intervention. The floodlights continued to cast a pale glow across the clearing, illuminating the stillness of man and animal standing together in a way that felt both fragile and unbreakable. Daniel adjusted his stance slightly, grounding himself, as Ghost remained close, his breathing now steadier, more controlled, as if the chaos inside him had begun to quiet. There was no urgency left in his posture, no defensive tension, only recognition settling into something resembling trust. The wind passed through again, softer than before, carrying with it the damp scent of earth and distant pine, and Ghost lifted his head slightly, as if acknowledging that even the world itself felt different now. Daniel did not move away. Instead, he remained exactly where he was, allowing Ghost to remain anchored, understanding that some returns cannot be rushed, only received. In the background, the rescue team began to subtly lower their equipment, no longer preparing for intervention but for observation, as if they were witnesses to something that would not be repeated. Ghost shifted his pause slightly, adjusting his stance so that he was fully aligned with Daniel, their proximity now natural rather than forced. The moment no longer carried tension, only continuity, as though something broken had quietly been restored without announcement or ceremony. Daniel finally allowed a faint breath to escape him, his shoulders relaxing almost imperceptibly, and Ghost responded in kind by remaining close, unafraid, no longer searching for escape or distance. The clearing, once filled with uncertainty, now held a silence that felt complete, not empty, as if every unanswered question had been set down for the first time in a long while. And in that silence, without words or commands, the bond between them settled into something undeniable, something that no separation had been able to erase. The silence inside the clearing had deepened into something almost sacred, as Daniel Cooper remained beside Ghost without movement, without pressure, allowing the white K9 to exist in a state he had not known for a long time, a state without resistance. Ghost's breathing had steadied now, slow and controlled, as though the weight that had been pressing against his instincts had finally loosened its grip. He stayed close to Daniel, not out of command, but out of certainty, as if proximity itself had become the only truth he could trust. The rescue team, once active and communicative, now stood in quiet observation, their radios lowered, their instructions paused, because there was nothing left to direct. Everything that mattered was already unfolding in stillness. Daniel finally shifted his stance slightly, not stepping away, but adjusting to remain grounded, his hand still resting on Ghost in a steady, familiar contact that required no words. Ghost responded with a subtle movement of his head, pressing lightly against Daniel's arm, as if confirming again and again that this was not a memory collapsing, but a return becoming real. The fog above the clearing had begun to thin, revealing sharper outlines of the surrounding trees and the distant staging vehicles, yet none of it felt intrusive anymore. The world outside their connection seemed distant, muted, as if it no longer had authority over this moment. Daniel's gaze lowered briefly, and when he spoke again, his voice was quiet, not carrying command or urgency, but something closer to acknowledgement, as if speaking into a past that had finally answered. Ghost responded not with sound, but with presence, leaning further into him, his body now fully relaxed, no longer divided between resistance and recognition. One of the handlers took a careful step back, sensing that even minimal movement might disrupt something fragile and irreversible. The air between Daniel and Ghost carried a stillness that was not emptiness, but completion, as if something unfinished had finally been given shape. Daniel's hand shifted slightly along Ghost's shoulder, a grounding touch that did not seek to direct, only to remain. Ghost closed his eyes for a brief moment, a gesture so subtle that it almost went unnoticed, but within it was an unmistakable release, as if the effort of holding on to separation had finally ended. The floodlights continued to hum softly above, casting long pale reflections across the damp ground. Yet even their mechanical presence felt distant now, absorbed into the quiet continuity of the scene. Daniel exhaled slowly, his posture easing further, no longer rigid with uncertainty, but steady in acceptance. Ghost remained close, his breathing now fully calm, his stance no longer guarded, as if every instinct that had once kept him distant had been replaced by something simpler and more certain. The surrounding team remained silent, not out of instruction, but out of understanding that what they were witnessing did not require commentary. The clearing felt smaller now, not physically, but emotionally, as if everything unnecessary had fallen away, leaving only what was essential. Daniel and Ghost stood together without movement, not as rescuer and rescued, not as handler and K9, but as two presences that had found their way back into alignment after being pulled apart by time. And in that stillness, there was no question left to ask, only the quiet recognition that some bonds do not end, they only wait. The stillness that had formed between Daniel Cooper and Ghost did not break, but it began to deepen in a way that made everything around them feel even more distant, as if the clearing itself had learned to hold its breath. The white K9 remained close, his body no longer tense or uncertain, but fully grounded in the presence of the man beside him, as though the years of separation had collapsed into a single point of understanding that neither of them needed to explain. Daniel stood quietly, his hand resting with steady familiarity along Ghost's shoulder, not exerting control, not asking for obedience, only maintaining connection in a way that felt natural, almost inevitable. The rescue team, once alert and ready for procedure, now stood in a loose semicircle, their attention no longer focused on action but on observation, because what they were witnessing did not belong to protocol. Ghost shifted slightly, adjusting his stance so that he was fully aligned with Daniel, their proximity no longer uncertain but balanced, like two pieces that had finally returned to the shape they were always meant to complete. Daniel's gaze lifted toward the fog, thinning above the trees, then returned to Ghost, and in that simple movement there was no urgency, only recognition that something unresolved had finally found resolution. A faint sound of wind passed through the clearing, brushing across the wet ground and moving through the floodlight beams, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow that felt almost like a quiet acknowledgement of change. Ghost did not react to the sound, because his attention was no longer divided. It was fully anchored in Daniel's presence. One of the handlers lowered his head slightly, stepping back without instruction, as if instinct alone told him that distance was the correct response to something this fragile. Daniel adjusted his posture subtly, not stepping forward or back, but settling into a steadier stance, as though preparing to remain there for as long as needed. Ghost responded by leaning in slightly, a small but certain motion that removed any remaining separation between them. There was no hesitation in it now, no guarded instinct, only trust returning in increments too subtle to measure but too strong to ignore. The floodlights above continued their steady glow, illuminating the clearing in pale, even tones, yet their presence felt less like observation and more like witness. Daniel finally let out a slow breath, his shoulders easing, and Ghost mirrored that release almost immediately, his body loosening further, as if responding to an emotional rhythm that had existed long before either of them understood it. The surrounding team remained silent, their radios inactive, their movements minimal, because there was no longer anything to manage. Everything had already shifted into stillness. Ghost closed his eyes again for a moment, not as retreat, but as acceptance, his breathing now fully calm, no longer shaped by uncertainty or distance. Daniel's hand remained steady, a constant point of contact that required no adjustment, no correction, only presence. The clearing, once filled with uncertainty and tension, now carried a quiet continuity that felt almost irreversible, as if the moment had settled into something permanent. And in that shared stillness, There was no need for commands, no need for explanation. Only the quiet certainty that whatever had been lost in time had not disappeared. It had simply been waiting for the right moment to return. The clearing remained still in a way that no one present could mistake for ordinary silence, because it was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something deeper that had settled between Daniel Cooper and Ghost. The white K9 stayed close, his body now fully aligned with Daniel's, no longer shifting between hesitation or instinct, but resting in a calm certainty that had not existed in him before this moment. Daniel remained steady beside him, his hand still resting lightly along Ghost's shoulder, not guiding, not correcting, only offering a grounded presence that required nothing in return. Around them, the rescue team stood in quiet formation, their earlier urgency replaced by a respectful stillness, as if any movement might disturb the fragile equilibrium that had formed. Ghost's breathing was slow and even now, his head slightly lowered but never turning away from Daniel. As though the fear of separation had finally been replaced by recognition, so complete it no longer needed confirmation. Daniel shifted his gaze briefly across the clearing, then back to Ghost. And in that motion there was a subtle change in his expression, not of surprise, but of acceptance, as if something long carried inside him had finally found its place outside. A faint breeze moved through the trees again, softer than before, carrying with it the damp scent of earth and pine, and Ghost responded with a small adjustment of posture, leaning in slightly, as though even the wind now felt secondary to the presence beside him. One of the handlers lowered his equipment entirely, stepping back another pace, not out of instruction but instinct, recognizing that what stood before them no longer required intervention. Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing further, and Ghost mirrored that release, his body settling fully into a posture that showed no resistance, no tension, only alignment. The floodlights above continued their steady glow, illuminating the clearing in pale arcs, but their mechanical presence felt distant now, almost irrelevant to what was unfolding beneath them. Ghost's eyes remained open but calm, no longer scanning, no longer searching, only resting in the certainty of recognition that had replaced everything he once carried alone. Daniel finally let his hand rest more fully, not changing pressure, only allowing the contact to deepen naturally, and Ghost responded without hesitation, pressing slightly closer as if reaffirming a bond that had never truly been broken. The surrounding team remained silent, their attention no longer divided, because there was nothing left to interpret, only something to witness. The air felt lighter now, not because anything had physically changed, but because the weight of uncertainty had dissolved into something more stable, something quietly irreversible. Ghost adjusted his stance one final time, now fully settled at Daniel's side, his presence no longer fragmented between past and present, but unified in a single point of trust. Daniel looked down at him for a long moment, and in that stillness there was no command, no question, only acknowledgement. And as the wind moved gently through the clearing once more, both remained exactly where they were, not as separate beings rediscovering each other, but as something that had always been connected, finally allowed to exist without distance. The stillness that had formed between Daniel Cooper and Ghost no longer felt like a temporary pause in time, but something closer to completion, as if the world had finally stopped asking questions it was never meant to answer. The white K9 remained pressed close to Daniel's side, his breathing steady and calm, his body no longer caught between instinct and memory, but fully settled into a presence that felt safe in a way he had not experienced for a long time. Daniel stood with him without movement, his hand still resting along Ghost's shoulder in a quiet, constant contact that carried no command, only understanding. Around them, the rescue team had lowered themselves into a loose stillness, their equipment now secondary to what they were witnessing, because the scene no longer belonged to procedure or protocol, but to something far more human and far more fragile. Ghost shifted only slightly, adjusting his stance so that his body remained aligned with Daniel's, as though even the smallest distance no longer felt necessary. Daniel's gaze remained forward for a moment, then softened as he looked down at the white K9 beside him, and in that simple movement there was no urgency, no expectation, only recognition that had already reached its conclusion. A faint breeze moved through the clearing again, carrying the damp scent of earth and distant pine, and Ghost responded by leaning in just slightly, reaffirming a connection that no longer needed proof. The floodlights above continued their steady hum, casting pale light across the clearing, but even their presence felt distant now, like background noise in a moment that no longer required attention to the outside world. One of the handlers lowered his head fully, stepping back another pace, as if instinct alone guided him away from something too delicate to disturb. Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing, and Ghost mirrored that release, his body now completely relaxed, as though every layer of tension he had carried had finally dissolved without resistance. The clearing itself seemed to soften, not physically, but emotionally, as if the space between man and animal had become filled with something steady and unspoken. Ghost closed his eyes briefly, not in withdrawal, but in acceptance, remaining close enough that his presence and Daniel's could no longer be distinguished as separate in feeling, only in form. Daniel did not move away. He did not adjust or reposition. He simply remained, allowing the moment to exist without interruption, as if understanding that some connections do not require continuation, only acknowledgement. The rescue team remained silent, their earlier uncertainty now replaced by quiet respect, because nothing about what they were witnessing required explanation anymore. Ghost opened his eyes again, calm and focused, and looked up at Daniel with a stillness that carried no confusion, only certainty. Daniel met that gaze without hesitation, and in that exchange there was no hierarchy, no distance, only a shared presence that had survived everything that had once pulled them apart. The wind moved once more through the trees, but neither of them reacted, because neither of them needed to. And in that final stretch of silence, the clearing held no tension, no waiting. Only the quiet reality that what had been broken by time had not ended. It had only waited to be remembered. The clearing had long stopped feeling like a place of uncertainty, and instead became something closer to a quiet point of return, where every sound, every breath, and every movement seemed to settle into a natural rhythm that no longer needed explanation. Daniel Cooper remained beside Ghost without change in posture, his hand still resting with steady familiarity along the white K9's shoulder, not as a gesture of control, but as an acknowledgement that required no words. Ghost stood fully grounded now, no longer shifting between hesitation or recognition, but existing in a state of calm certainty that felt as though it had been there all along, simply waiting to be uncovered. Around them, the rescue team had fully lowered their operational stance, their equipment no longer raised, their radios silent, their attention no longer divided between protocol and action, but focused entirely on the stillness unfolding in front of them. The fog that had once clung heavily to the clearing had thinned further, allowing soft evening light to pass through the trees in long, muted lines that painted the ground in pale gold and gray. Daniel finally shifted his gaze outward, scanning the clearing once, not with concern, but with quiet awareness, before returning it to Ghost, as if confirming what no longer needed confirmation. Ghost responded by leaning slightly closer, his body relaxed in a way that suggested the absence of all internal conflict, as though every fragment of distance he had carried had finally been set down. One of the handlers took a slow step forward, then stopped again, sensing that even movement might disturb a moment that had already reached its natural conclusion. Daniel's breathing remained steady, and when he exhaled, it was not relief or surprise, but something quieter, like acceptance that something unfinished had finally been allowed to complete itself. Ghost's eyes remained open, calm, and fully present, no longer searching, no longer waiting, only resting in the reality of what stood beside him. The floodlights above continued their soft mechanical hum, but even that sound felt distant now, absorbed into the larger silence that surrounded them. Daniel lowered his hand slightly along Ghost's back, maintaining contact without adjustment, and Ghost responded with the smallest shift of weight, ensuring that the connection between them remained unbroken. The rescue team stood fully still now, no longer observing as professionals, but as witnesses to something that existed beyond procedure or expectation. The air itself seemed lighter, not because anything had changed physically, but because the tension that had once filled the space had dissolved completely. Ghost closed his eyes for a moment, not as retreat, but as acknowledgement, and when he opened them again, his gaze returned immediately to Daniel, steady and certain. Daniel met that gaze without hesitation, and in that exchange there was no hierarchy, no distance, no need for instruction or reassurance. Only presence remained, simple and complete. The wind passed gently through the trees once more, but neither man nor animal reacted, because there was nothing left to react to. Everything that had been fractured by time, separation, and silence had already found its place again in the quiet between them. And in that final stillness, there was no beginning or ending, only the enduring truth that some bonds do not return because they never truly leave.